Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bone-chilling reality of medieval survival, where winter wasn't just a season, it was a test of human endurance that claimed more lives than any plague or war. We're diving deep into the brutal world of medieval winters, when the temperature drop meant the difference between life and death, and most people simply didn't make it to spring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, you're living in the year 1348, somewhere in the English countryside. The leaves have fallen, the harvest is done, and that first, bitter wind cuts through your threadbare cloak like a knife through parchment. You look up at the grey sky, heavy with the promise of snow, and you feel something most modern people never experience. True, primal fear. Not fear of missing a deadline or running out of battery on your phone, but the ancient, bone-deep terror that comes from knowing winter is coming and you might not survive it. This isn't Hollywood's version of medieval life, with roaring hearths and cozy taverns where everyone's laughing and drinking ale. This is the reality that our ancestors faced every single year. A reality where winter was nature's way of culling the weak, the unprepared, and sometimes even the strong. Tonight, we're going to explore why surviving a medieval winter was almost impossible, and how millions of people face this annual dance with death. You see, when we think about medieval dangers, we usually imagine knights in battle, or perhaps the Black Death sweeping through villages. But here's what most people don't realize. Winter killed more medieval Europeans than war and plague combined. It was the silent assassin that crept in every year, predictable as clockwork, yet somehow always catching people unprepared. The statistics are staggering. Historical records suggest that in harsh winters, mortality rates could spike by 300%. Entire villages would be found empty when spring finally arrived, their inhabitants having succumbed not to sword or sickness, but to the relentless cold and hunger that winter brought. Children, the elderly, and the poor were always the first to go, but even healthy adults could find themselves overwhelmed by the brutal combination of freezing temperatures, food scarcity, and the constant struggle just to stay warm. But what made medieval winters so uniquely deadly? Why couldn't these people, who had survived for generations in these same lands, simply adapt and overcome? The answer lies in a perfect storm of factors that modern humanity has completely forgotten about. Factors that turned every winter into a potential apocalypse for medieval communities. Let's start with the most obvious challenge, the cold itself. Now, you might think you know what cold feels like. Maybe you've been camping in winter, or your heating went out for a few hours. But medieval cold was different. It was personal. It lived with you, in your bones, in your breath, in every moment of your existence, from November until March. Medieval homes weren't the cozy cottages you see in fairy tale illustrations. They were essentially wooden boxes with gaps. The walls were made of wattle and daub, basically sticks woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. People literally lived in houses held together with manure, and these walls, no matter how carefully constructed, had cracks. Lots of them. Wind would whistle through these gaps like nature's own torture device, carrying away any warmth faster than it could be generated. The roofs were thatched, which sounds quaint until you realize that thatch is basically just dried grass piled on wooden beams. When it rained or snowed, these roofs leaked. When the wind blew hard, pieces of thatch would fly away, leaving holes that let in both cold air and precipitation. Imagine trying to sleep while freezing water drips onto your face, knowing that you have no way to fix the roof until spring. Assuming you live that long, Windows were a luxury that most people couldn't afford. Those who had them often covered them with oiled cloth or thin animal hides, materials that provided minimal insulation and let in very little light. Most people lived in homes with no windows at all, relying entirely on the door and perhaps a few small holes in the walls for light and ventilation. This meant that homes were not only cold, but also dark for most of the winter months. The floors were usually just packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw if the family was fortunate. But earth is a terrible insulator. The cold from the frozen ground would seep up through the floor, making it impossible to ever truly get warm. People would pile on every piece of clothing they owned, wrap themselves in whatever blankets or animal skins they had, and still spend the entire winter shivering. Heating was primitive and dangerous. Most homes had a central hearth, basically a fire pit in the middle of the main room. There were no chimneys in most peasant homes, so smoke would fill the house and eventually drift out through holes in the roof or cracks in the walls. This meant that you had to choose between freezing to death or slowly suffocating on smoke. Many people chose a middle ground, keeping small fires that provided minimal warmth while filling their lungs with toxic fumes all winter long. Fuel for fires was another massive problem. Wood had to be gathered and chopped during the warmer months, then carefully rationed throughout the winter. Many families would run out of firewood weeks or even months before spring arrived. When that happened, they would burn anything they could find: furniture, tools, even parts of their own homes. There are records of people dismantling their interior walls to feed their fires, essentially destroying their shelter in a desperate attempt to stay warm. But even when fuel was available, medieval fires were nothing like the efficient heating systems we're used to today. The heat from an open fire radiates outward in a small circle, warming only the side of your body facing the flames. Turn around, and your back would immediately start freezing again. People would literally rotate like rotisserie chickens, trying to warm all sides of their bodies in turn. The smoke from these fires created additional health problems. Constant exposure to wood smoke led to respiratory issues that weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to the diseases that thrived in the close quarters of winter living. Many people developed what we would now recognize as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, struggling to breathe properly throughout the cold months. Sleep was nearly impossible during the worst winter nights. People would pile together under whatever coverings they had, often sharing body heat with their entire extended family, and sometimes even their livestock. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford when survival was at stake. But even with multiple people huddled together, the cold would seep through their blankets and clothes, making restful sleep elusive. The psychological impact of this constant cold was devastating. Imagine living for months knowing that every moment of every day you're fighting for your life against an enemy you can't see, can't fight with weapons, and can't escape from. The cold became a constant companion, a reminder that death was always just a few degrees away. But the cold was only the beginning of winter's challenges. Food scarcity turned the season into a slow-motion famine that tested every family's ability to survive. Medieval agriculture was entirely dependent on the seasons, and winter was a time when nothing grew. The harvest from the previous autumn had to last until the next spring's crops could be planted and grown, a period of roughly 6 months. For most peasant families, this meant carefully rationing every scrap of food from November until May. They would start the winter with stores of grain, preserved meat, dried vegetables, and perhaps some dairy products that could last without refrigeration. But calculating the right amount of food was a deadly gamble. Store too little, and you'd starve before spring. Store too much, and you might not have enough land or resources to plant the next year's crops. Medieval preservation techniques were primitive by modern standards. Meat was preserved by smoking, salting, or drying, processes that were time-consuming and didn't always work perfectly. Salt was expensive and not always available, especially for poorer families. Smoking required a constant supply of wood and careful attention to prevent the meat from spoiling. Drying was dependent on weather conditions that weren't always cooperative. Grains were stored in granaries or large containers, but these were vulnerable to moisture, insects, and rodents. A family's entire winter food supply could be destroyed by rats, weevils, or simply by dampness that caused the grain to rot. There was no backup plan, no grocery store to run to, no government assistance. If your food stores were compromised, you faced starvation. The diet during winter months was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Most people survived on a basic porridge made from whatever grains they had stored, supplemented occasionally with small amounts of preserved meat or vegetables. This diet lacked essential vitamins and nutrients, leading to malnutrition that weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to disease. Scurvy was common during the winter months, caused by a lack of vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables. People's gums would bleed, their teeth would fall out, and old wounds would reopen. Without understanding the nutritional cause, medieval people attributed these symptoms to bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment. Fresh food was virtually impossible to obtain during winter. There were no greenhouses, no imported foods, no way to preserve fresh fruits and vegetables for extended periods. People would dream about fresh apples or green vegetables the way modern people might dream about luxury vacations. The psychological impact of this dietary monotony, combined with the constant hunger, created a form of depression that made the dark winter months even more unbearable. Water presented its own set of challenges during medieval winters. Rivers and wells would freeze, making it difficult or impossible to obtain fresh water for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. People would have to break ice, melt snow, or travel long distances to find unfrozen water sources. This was not only time-consuming and dangerous, but it also required fuel to melt ice or snow, further depleting precious firewood supplies. The water that was available was often contaminated. Medieval people had no understanding of bacteria or water purification. They would drink from the same sources where animals drank, where waste was disposed of, and where disease-carrying organisms thrived. During winter, when people were weakened by cold and malnutrition, contaminated water could easily trigger deadly outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, or other waterborne illnesses. Even when clean water was available, storing it presented problems. Water would freeze in containers, breaking pottery and making it impossible to access. People had to keep water near fires to prevent freezing, but this required constant attention and fuel. Many families would ration water just like food, using as little as possible to conserve their supplies and fuel. The lack of adequate water also meant that personal hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain during winter months. People couldn't bathe regularly, couldn't wash their clothes, and couldn't keep their living spaces clean. This created ideal conditions for parasites and diseases to spread, turning winter homes into breeding grounds for illness. Disease thrived in these conditions like nowhere else. When you pack multiple generations of a family into a single room with no ventilation, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems, you create the perfect storm for epidemic illness. Medieval winters weren't just cold and hungry, they were plague incubators on a scale that would horrify modern health officials. The most common killer was what medieval people called the winter fever. We now know this was likely a combination of influenza, pneumonia, and other respiratory infections that spread like wildfire through cramped living quarters. When one person got sick, everyone got sick. There was no isolation, no separate bedrooms, no way to quarantine the ill from the healthy. Entire families would succumb within days of each other. Tuberculosis was another winter executioner. The constant exposure to smoke-filled air weakened people's lungs, while malnutrition destroyed their ability to fight off infection. The disease would start with a persistent cough, then progress to bloody sputum, fever, and eventually death. Medieval people called it consumption, because it literally consumed the body from within, leaving behind skeletal figures who wasted away over the course of the winter months. Dysentery turned winter into a nightmare of intestinal agony. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and the stress of cold and hunger created perfect conditions for this deadly disease. People would suffer from severe diarrhea, dehydration, and abdominal pain, while having no access to clean water or proper medical care. The disease was so common that medieval people considered it a normal part of winter life, not realizing that their living conditions were creating a death trap. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval winter disease was how it compounded other survival challenges. A sick person couldn't gather firewood, couldn't prepare food, couldn't contribute to the family's survival efforts. When the primary breadwinner fell ill, the entire household's chances of survival plummeted. Children would watch their parents waste away from fever while simultaneously facing starvation and freezing temperatures. Medieval medicine was not only useless against these winter diseases, it was often actively harmful. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their treatments included bloodletting, purging, and administering toxic substances that weakened patients further. A person with pneumonia might be bled until they were too weak to cough up the fluid in their lungs, essentially ensuring their death. The few remedies that might have helped were expensive and unavailable to most people. Honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, was a luxury item. Herbs that could ease symptoms were difficult to obtain during winter months when nothing grew. Most families had to rely on folk remedies passed down through generations, many of which were based on superstition rather than any medical understanding. Prayer was often the only medicine available to medieval families facing winter illness. Churches would be packed with desperate people begging for divine intervention, unknowingly spreading disease even further through their close contact. The irony was cruel, people seeking salvation in the very places that helped seal their fate. The psychological toll of watching family members die from winter diseases was devastating. Parents would lose multiple children in a single season. Spouses would become widowed just when they needed each other most for survival. The grief and trauma of these losses added another layer of suffering to an already unbearable situation. Mental health, though not understood in medieval times, was severely impacted by the combination of seasonal depression, grief, malnutrition, and constant fear. People would develop what we now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. Some would simply give up, losing the will to fight for survival. Others would become violent or erratic, their minds broken by months of unrelenting stress. The darkness of winter made everything worse. With no artificial lighting beyond candles and oil lamps, which were expensive and often unavailable, people lived in near constant darkness for months at a time. They would go to bed shortly after sunset and wake up hours before dawn, spending most of their waking hours in dim, smoky interiors that felt more like caves than homes. This darkness affected people's circadian rhythms and vitamin D production, contributing to depression and weakening their immune systems even further. Modern science has shown us how crucial sunlight is for mental and physical health, but medieval people had no understanding of these connections. They simply endured months of darkness, not knowing that the lack of light was slowly killing them. The social fabric of communities began to fray under the pressure of winter survival. Neighbors who had been friends during the prosperous months of summer would become competitors for scarce resources when winter arrived. Food theft was common, and families would jealously guard their stores from desperate neighbors. Trust broke down as survival instinct took over. Some communities tried to organize collective survival efforts, sharing resources and labor to increase everyone's chances. But these efforts often failed when resources became too scarce to share. The mathematics of survival were brutal. There simply wasn't enough food, fuel, or warm shelter for everyone to make it through a harsh winter. Violence increased during the winter months as desperate people fought over the basic necessities of life. A family's store of firewood might be raided in the middle of the night. Food caches would be broken into and stolen. Even church stores, supposedly protected by divine law, were sometimes plundered by starving parishioners who faced the choice between sin and death. The legal system broke down during the worst winter months. Courts couldn't function when travel was impossible and when judges and officials were focused on their own survival. This meant that crimes went unpunished, disputes went unresolved, and the social order that held communities together during better times simply collapsed. Women faced additional challenges that made winter survival even more difficult. Pregnant women had to endure the harsh conditions while carrying and eventually delivering babies in freezing, unsanitary conditions. Childbirth during winter was often a death sentence for both mother and child. The lack of proper nutrition, warmth, and medical care made complications almost inevitable. Mothers watched helplessly as their children grew thin and weak from malnutrition. There were no supplements, no special foods for growing bodies, no way to ensure that children received the nutrients they needed. Many mothers would give up their own meager food rations to feed their children, slowly starving themselves in a desperate attempt to keep their offspring alive. The elderly were often the first casualties of winter's assault. Their weakened bodies couldn't generate enough heat to stay warm, couldn't fight off diseases as effectively, and couldn't compete with younger family members for limited food resources. In the cruelest calculations of survival, families sometimes had to make impossible choices about who would receive care and who would be left to die. Children who survived winter often bore permanent physical and psychological scars from their experiences. Malnutrition during crucial developmental years stunted their growth and damaged their health permanently. The trauma of watching family members die, of constant hunger and cold, of living in fear for months at a time, created psychological wounds that lasted lifetimes. The cycle was vicious and seemingly inescapable. Each harsh winter weakened the survivors, making them less able to prepare for the next winter. Families that lost their breadwinners had fewer resources to gather food and fuel for the following year. Communities that lost significant populations had fewer hands to work the fields and fewer people to share the burden of survival. Yet somehow, against all odds, some people did survive these medieval winters. They developed strategies, both individual and collective, that gave them just enough of an edge to see another spring. These survivors weren't lucky, they were ruthlessly practical. They understood that sentiment and compassion were luxuries they couldn't afford when death was knocking at their door every single night. The families that made it through winter were the ones who had learned to think like generals planning a military campaign. Except their enemy was nature itself, and surrender meant extinction. The most successful winter survivors started their preparations in early summer, not autumn like most people assumed. While their neighbors were celebrating the warm weather and abundant food, these families were already calculating how many calories they would need to survive the next winter. They counted every grain of wheat, every preserved vegetable, every scrap of dried meat, like a miser counting coins. They developed what we might call the mathematics of survival. A typical adult needed roughly 1,500 calories per day to maintain basic bodily functions in cold weather. Children needed less, but pregnant or nursing women needed more. Multiply that by the number of people in the household, then by the number of days winter typically lasted in their region, and you had your minimum food requirement. But smart families added a buffer of at least 20%, because winters could run long, and miscalculations were fatal. These survival experts also understood the concept of caloric density long before nutritional science existed. They prioritized foods that provided the most energy in the smallest space. Nuts, when available, were worth their weight in gold because they provided fats and proteins that could sustain a person through the darkest months. Animal fat was carefully rendered and stored, not just for cooking, but as a concentrated source of calories that could mean the difference between life and death. The truly savvy families created what amounted to medieval insurance policies. They would establish relationships with multiple communities, sometimes traveling considerable distances to diversify their survival options. If their local harvest failed, they might have relatives or trading partners in other regions who could provide emergency supplies. These networks were maintained year-round through marriages, trade relationships, and mutual aid agreements. Storage techniques separated the survivors from the casualties. While most families simply piled grain in whatever containers they had available, the experts built sophisticated storage systems designed to protect food from every possible threat. They lined storage pits with stones to prevent moisture, created multiple smaller caches instead of one large store to minimize losses from spoilage or theft, and developed intricate systems for rotating stock to ensure nothing went bad. Some families became masters of controlled fermentation, creating foods that would not only last through winter, but actually improve with age. Sauerkraut, fermented fish, aged cheeses, and pickled vegetables provided both nutrition and variety during the monotonous winter months. These fermented foods also contained beneficial bacteria that helped maintain digestive health when fresh foods were unavailable. The most successful winter survivors understood that warmth was more important than food. A well-fed person could die from cold in a single night, but a warm person could survive on minimal food for weeks. They invested enormous effort in creating what we might call thermal fortresses, homes designed specifically to trap and conserve heat. These weren't the picturesque cottages of fairy tales. They were utilitarian survival shelters. The smartest builders created homes with thick walls, low ceilings, and minimal windows. They understood that heat rises, so they built sleeping areas in lofts or elevated platforms where warm air would collect. Some families even shared their homes with livestock, using the animal's body heat as a supplemental heating system. Insulation techniques were surprisingly sophisticated among the survivors. They packed walls with everything from animal hair to dried moss to create air pockets that trapped heat. Some families lined their walls with animal hides, fur side inward, creating a natural insulation system. The wealthiest might have tapestries or thick cloth hangings, but even poor families could stuff rags and scraps into wall cracks to reduce heat loss. The most ingenious heating innovation was the development of thermal mass systems. Smart families would heat large stones in their fires during the day, then wrap these stones in cloth and place them in their beds at night. The stones would radiate heat for hours, keeping people warm long after the fire had died down. Some families even heated stones specifically for this purpose, sacrificing precious fuel during the day to ensure survival through the night. Clothing strategies among survivors were equally sophisticated. They understood layering long before modern outdoor gear companies existed. The key was trapping air between layers of clothing, creating insulation from their own body heat. They would wear multiple thin layers rather than one thick garment, allowing them to adjust their warmth throughout the day as needed. Successful families also understood the importance of keeping extremities warm. They knew that once hands and feet became cold, the body would start shutting down blood flow to these areas, eventually leading to frostbite and death. And they created primitive mittens and socks from animal fur and leather, sometimes stuffed with dried grass or moss for additional insulation. The survivors developed sophisticated fuel management systems that would impress modern efficiency experts. They understood different types of wood burned at different rates and provided different amounts of heat. Hardwoods like oak burned longer and hotter, but were harder to ignite. Softwoods like pine caught fire easily, but burned quickly. Smart families stockpiled both types, using softwood for kindling and hardwood for sustained heat. They also learned to bank fires, a technique that allowed them to maintain heat overnight without burning excessive amounts of fuel. By carefully arranging coals and ash, they could keep a fire smouldering for hours, ready to be rekindled in the morning without starting from scratch. This technique could save enough fuel over a winter to mean the difference between survival and death. Some families developed renewable fuel strategies, growing specific plants during the summer that could be harvested and dried for winter fuel. Certain grasses, when properly dried and bundled, could burn hot enough to cook food or provide temporary warmth. While these plant-based fuels couldn't replace wood entirely, they could extend precious wood supplies when resources ran low. The most successful winter survivors also mastered the psychology of survival. They understood that maintaining morale was crucial for getting through the dark months. Families that survived together often had elaborate storytelling traditions, games, and activities that could be done in the dark around a small fire. These weren't just entertainment. They were survival tools that kept people's minds active and hopeful. These families also developed sophisticated rationing strategies that went beyond simple calorie counting. They understood that providing small amounts of variety and special treats could maintain psychological health even when overall nutrition was limited. A tiny bit of honey or a few preserved berries could provide hope and pleasure that helped people endure weeks of monotonous porridge. Religious and spiritual practices played crucial roles in survival psychology. Families that maintained regular prayer, meditation, or storytelling rituals often had better survival rates, not because of divine intervention, but because these practices provided structure, hope, and meaning during the darkest times. The psychological benefits of believing that suffering had purpose helped people endure conditions that might otherwise break their will to live. Community cooperation among successful families took forms that seem almost military in their organization. They would establish watch systems to guard against theft, coordinate fuel gathering to maximize efficiency, and create communication networks to share information about weather, food availability, and threats. These weren't formal organizations, but informal alliances based on mutual survival needs. Some communities developed sophisticated early warning systems for extreme weather. Experienced observers could read subtle signs in animal behavior, cloud formations, and wind patterns that indicated severe cold was approaching. This advance warning allowed families to take extra precautions, gather additional fuel, or seek shelter with better prepared neighbors. The most successful communities also maintained what we might call winter emergency protocols. When someone died, their resources would be redistributed according to predetermined agreements. When someone became too sick to contribute, the community would decide collectively whether they could afford to support that person or whether resources needed to be redirected to those with better survival chances. These decisions were heartbreakingly practical. Families that survived were often the ones willing to make impossible choices about resource allocation. They might abandon elderly relatives who were consuming resources without contributing to survival efforts. They might refuse to share food with neighbors, even close friends, when their own family's survival was at stake. Water management among survivors was equally sophisticated. They learned to collect and store water during autumn when sources were still flowing freely. Some families dug special storage pits lined with clay to hold water through the winter. Others learned to efficiently melt snow and ice, techniques that conserved precious fuel while providing necessary hydration. The smartest families also understood water quality issues instinctively. They learned which sources were most likely to remain clean, how to recognize contaminated water, and primitive filtration techniques using sand, charcoal, and cloth. While they didn't understand bacteria, they recognized that some water sources made people sick, while others didn't. Medical knowledge among survivors was limited but practical. They learned to recognize the early signs of common winter diseases and develop treatments that, while not scientifically sound, sometimes helped. They understood that keeping sick family members warm and hydrated improved survival chances. They learned which herbs and remedies actually provided relief versus those that were merely superstitious. Some families became skilled at basic surgical procedures, setting broken bones, treating wounds, and even performing crude dental work. These skills weren't learned from books or formal training. They were developed through necessity and passed down through generations of winter survivors. The most successful families also understood the importance of maintaining physical fitness throughout the winter months. Even when food was scarce, they recognized that maintaining muscle mass and cardiovascular health improved their chances of surviving cold and disease. They developed indoor exercises and activities that could be performed in confined spaces. Mental exercises were equally important. Families that kept their minds active through puzzles, memory games, and intellectual challenges often had better survival rates. These activities weren't just entertainment, they were cognitive training that helped people make better decisions under stress and maintain hope during the darkest periods. Survivors also developed sophisticated understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. They learned to recognize signs of depression, despair, and mental breakdown in family members. While they had no formal treatments, they developed strategies for providing emotional support, maintaining group cohesion, and preventing the psychological collapse that often preceded physical death. The most successful families maintained detailed mental records of what worked and what didn't work during each winter. They would spend summer months analyzing their previous year's performance, identifying weaknesses in their preparation, and developing improved strategies for the coming winter. This continuous improvement approach gave them significant advantages over families who simply hoped each winter would be easier than the last. These survivor families also understood the importance of physical positioning within their communities. They chose home locations that provided natural wind protection, access to water sources, and proximity to other survival resources. Some families would actually relocate during summer months to optimize their winter survival chances. The trading and bartering skills of successful families were highly developed. They understood that different resources had different values at different times of year. Something that was common in summer might be invaluable in winter. They would trade summer abundance for winter necessities, often making deals that seemed disadvantageous in the moment, but proved crucial for survival. Perhaps most importantly, the families that consistently survived medieval winters understood that preparation was never complete. They lived with the constant awareness that next winter was always coming, that every warm day was borrowed time that should be used to improve their chances of seeing another spring. This mindset shaped every decision they made, every resource they allocated, every relationship they maintained. These weren't heroes or saints. They were ordinary people who had learned extraordinary lessons about what it took to survive when nature itself seemed determined to kill them. Their strategies were born from desperation, refined through loss, and passed down through generations who understood that winter was not just a season, but an annual test of human ingenuity, endurance, and will to live. Yet even among these master survivors, success was never guaranteed. A single miscalculation, one unexpected disaster, a winter that lasted longer than normal, and even the most prepared family could find themselves facing the same desperate struggle that claimed so many of their neighbors. The margin between life and death was razor thin, and luck still played a role that no amount of preparation could completely eliminate. But survival wasn't just about individual families making smart choices. There were larger forces at work, environmental and social pressures that could doom entire regions regardless of how well prepared people thought they were. These were the wildcards that turned winter from a manageable challenge into an absolute catastrophe. The kinds of events that made even the most experienced survivors realize just how powerless they really were against nature's fury. The most terrifying of these was what historians now call the volcanic winter phenomenon. When major volcanic eruptions occurred anywhere in the world, they could trigger climate changes that made winters colder and longer across entire continents. Medieval people had no understanding of global weather patterns or volcanic ash clouds, so when these events struck, they seemed like divine punishment or the end of the world itself. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 caused what became known as the Year Without a Summer. But medieval Europe experienced similar events that were just as devastating. When Elgia Eru CE, it created in Iceland in 939, a haze that blocked sunlight across Europe for months. Temperatures dropped dramatically, growing seasons shortened. and what should have been manageable winters became death sentences for thousands of communities. People would watch the sky darken with an unnatural haze that blocked the sun for weeks at a time. Crops would fail not just in their local area but across vast regions. The interconnected nature of these failures meant that the usual survival strategy of trading with neighboring communities became impossible because everyone was facing the same catastrophe simultaneously. These volcanic winters created cascading failures that were impossible for medieval people to understand or prepare for. A family might have stored enough food for a normal 6-month winter, only to discover that this winter would last 8 or 9 months. Their carefully calculated survival margins would evaporate as the cold stretched on week after week, with no sign of spring's arrival. The psychological impact of these extended winters was devastating. People who had survived multiple normal winters would find themselves facing starvation in February or March, just when they thought they were almost safe. The hope that had sustained them through the dark months would crumble as their food stores dwindled and the cold showed no signs of breaking. Even worse were the little ice age periods that could last for years or even decades. Starting around 1300 and continuing intermittently until the mid-1800s, these climate shifts brought average temperatures down several degrees across Europe. What might not sound like much to modern ears was absolutely catastrophic for medieval survival strategies. During Little Ice Age winters, rivers that normally stayed liquid would freeze solid for months. The Thames in London became so frozen that people could walk across it, but this novelty came at a terrible cost. Transportation networks broke down completely when waterways froze. Mills that depended on flowing water to grind grain would shut down for months, leaving communities unable to process what food they did have. Agricultural zones shifted dramatically during these cold periods. Areas that had been able to grow wheat for generations suddenly couldn't support any grain crops at all. Vineyards that had flourished for centuries withered and died as temperatures dropped below their survival thresholds. Entire regional economies based on specific crops simply collapsed, leaving populations with no way to sustain themselves. The social implications were staggering. When agricultural productivity dropped across wide areas, it created refugee crises as people abandoned their homes in search of regions that could still support human life. But these climate refugees often found that their destination areas were also struggling, creating conflicts and competition that made survival even more difficult for everyone involved. Trade networks that had developed over centuries broke down during extended cold periods. Merchant routes that depended on predictable weather patterns became unreliable or impossible to navigate. Ships couldn't sail through ice-clogged harbours. Mountain passes became impassable for months longer than usual. The flow of goods that many communities depended on for winter survival simply stopped. Currency systems also collapsed during these extreme climate events. Money had no value when there was no food to buy. Precious metals couldn't keep you warm or feed your family. Barter systems emerged, but even these broke down when everyone was trying to trade the same surplus items for the same scarce necessities. The breakdown of normal economic and social systems led to what historians call demographic collapse. Entire regions would see their populations drop by 50% or more during extreme climate events. Villages that had existed for centuries would be completely abandoned. The survivors would flee to areas that seemed more viable, often overwhelming the resources of their destination communities. Legal and governmental systems couldn't cope with these widespread disasters. Courts couldn't function when judges and officials were focused on their own survival. Tax collection became impossible when the people who owed taxes were dead or had fled. Military systems broke down when soldiers couldn't be fed or equipped. The entire structure of medieval society would temporarily collapse during the worst climate disasters. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of these large-scale climate events was how they created cycles of vulnerability that lasted for generations. A community that lost half its population during one extreme winter would be less able to prepare for the next winter. Fewer people meant less labour for gathering food and fuel, less knowledge preserved as experienced survivors died, and less resilience when the next crisis struck. Children who survived these catastrophic winters often grew up permanently damaged by malnutrition and trauma. They became adults with reduced physical capabilities and shortened lifespans. When they tried to raise families of their own, they passed on not just genetic damage from their childhood malnutrition, but also incomplete survival knowledge because so many of the older generation had died during their youth. The religious and cultural impacts were equally profound. Communities that had maintained specific traditions and practices for centuries would lose the knowledge holders during extreme winter events. Religious practices, folk wisdom, craft techniques, and survival strategies would simply vanish when the people who knew them died or were forced to flee. Some communities developed what amounted to cultural PTSD, becoming obsessively focused on winter preparation to the point where it dominated every aspect of their lives. These societies would spend the entire growing season preparing for winter, sometimes to the detriment of other necessary activities. They lived in constant fear of the cold months, passing down terror along with survival techniques. Other communities went in the opposite direction, developing fatalistic attitudes that made them less likely to prepare adequately for winter challenges. Having survived one catastrophic winter through luck rather than preparation, they would assume that fate or divine providence would protect them again. This psychological response often made them more vulnerable to future disasters. The interaction between these large-scale climate events and local survival strategies created complex feedback loops that medieval people couldn't understand. A volcanic winter might kill off predators that normally controlled rodent populations, leading to explosive growth in rats and mice that would consume stored grain supplies. Or unusual weather patterns might create breeding conditions for disease-carrying insects that would spread illnesses through weakened populations. Forest ecosystems would be disrupted by extreme cold events, changing the types of fuel available for heating and the kinds of wild foods that people could forage to supplement their stored supplies. Trees that had provided reliable fuel for generations might die off during extended cold periods, forcing communities to find new fuel sources or face freezing. Animal populations that people depended on for meat, milk, and warmth would also be devastated by extreme climate events. Domestic livestock would die in large numbers when pastures remained frozen longer than usual, or when stored animal feed ran out. Wild game populations would migrate to warmer regions or die off entirely, eliminating important protein sources for human communities. The cumulative effect of these disruptions was to make medieval communities incredibly fragile in the face of any additional stresses. A population that was barely surviving an extended cold period would be devastated by any other crisis that occurred simultaneously. Disease outbreaks, military conflicts, or even minor accidents could become catastrophic when they happened during extreme weather events. Recovery from these major climate disasters often took decades or even centuries. It wasn't just a matter of waiting for normal weather to return. Entire agricultural systems had to be rebuilt, trade networks re-established, and populations regrown from the small numbers of survivors. The knowledge and skills that had been lost during the crisis had to be redeveloped, often through painful trial and error. During recovery periods, communities were often more vulnerable than they had been before the crisis. The survivors had trauma and health problems from their experiences. The social institutions that had provided stability were weakened or destroyed. The infrastructure that had supported the previous population was often damaged or inadequate for rebuilding efforts. The genetic bottlenecks created by these population crashes had long-term consequences that medieval people couldn't understand but definitely experienced. When only a small percentage of a population survived extreme events, the genetic diversity of the survivors was reduced, making future generations more susceptible to diseases and genetic disorders. Cultural bottlenecks were equally significant. When most of the knowledge holders in a community died during a crisis, the survivors often had to reinvent techniques and practices that had been developed over generations. This process of cultural rebuilding was slow and often resulted in the loss of sophisticated practices that had previously helped communities survive difficult periods. The psychological legacy of these extreme events lasted for generations. Communities that had experienced a demographic collapse during climate disasters developed cultural memories of those events that influenced their behavior for centuries afterward. Stories and traditions would preserve warnings about the dangers of winter that seemed excessive to people who hadn't experienced the worst-case scenarios. These cultural memories sometimes contained valuable survival information, but they also sometimes included superstitions and fears that actually made communities less effective at dealing with winter challenges. The balance between learning from past disasters and being paralyzed by fear of them was delicate and not always successfully maintained. Documentation of these extreme events was often poor because the people who might have recorded them were focused on survival rather than historical record-keeping. Many of the most catastrophic winter events in medieval history are known only through indirect evidence like tree rings, ice cores, and archaeological remains rather than written accounts. This lack of documentation meant that communities often couldn't learn from the experiences of other regions that had faced similar challenges. A technique that had saved lives in one area during an extreme winter might never be shared with communities facing the same conditions elsewhere because there was no effective way to communicate this information across distances. The isolation that made winter survival so difficult also prevented the spread of innovations and adaptations that could have improved survival rates. Communities were essentially conducting independent experiments in winter survival, often repeating the same mistakes that had been made and solved elsewhere. Modern climate science has revealed that many of these extreme medieval winter events were connected to global climate patterns that medieval people had no way of understanding or predicting. Solar activity cycles, ocean current changes, and atmospheric circulation patterns all influenced European winters in ways that seemed random and unpredictable to people living through them. Understanding these larger patterns helps explain why medieval winter survival was so difficult and why even well-prepared communities could find themselves facing impossible challenges. The strategies that worked during normal winters could become completely inadequate when larger climate forces created conditions far outside the range of normal experience. But even within these larger climate patterns, there were smaller-scale events that could turn a manageable winter into a disaster. Unusual storm patterns could dump snow loads that collapsed roofs and made travel impossible for weeks at a time. Ice storms could destroy food storage facilities and make it impossible to gather fuel. Flooding during winter thaws could contaminate water supplies and destroy stored foods. These smaller disasters often struck without warning and lasted just long enough to exhaust a community's emergency reserves. A week-long blizzard might not seem catastrophic, but if it prevented people from gathering fuel just when their supplies were running low, it could trigger a cascade of problems that proved fatal. The unpredictability of these events was one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of medieval winter survival. People could prepare for average conditions, and even for worse than average conditions, but they couldn't prepare for every possible disaster scenario. Living with this uncertainty required a kind of mental fortitude that modern people rarely need to develop. The social tensions created by this constant uncertainty often erupted during winter months when communities were already under stress. Accusations would fly about who was hoarding resources, who wasn't contributing fairly to community survival efforts, and who was responsible when things went wrong. These social conflicts could destroy the cooperation that was essential for survival. Leadership during extreme winter events required skills that were rarely needed during normal times. Community leaders had to make decisions about resource allocation that literally determined who lived and who died. They had to maintain morale when everyone was suffering. They had to enforce difficult rules about sharing and conservation when people were desperate. The moral complexity of these leadership decisions was staggering. Should limited medical care go to the people most likely to survive, or to the people who had contributed most to the community? Should scarce food be distributed equally or given preferentially to the workers who were essential for everyone's survival? Should resources be used to help the weakest members of the community or conserved to ensure that the strongest members could continue their survival efforts? These weren't abstract philosophical questions, but daily practical decisions that determined the survival of real people. The leaders who made these choices had to live with the consequences, both practical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Many community leaders didn't survive the psychological stress of making these impossible decisions repeatedly throughout a harsh winter. The children who witnessed these extreme survival situations often carried the psychological impact for their entire lives. They learned lessons about human nature, about the fragility of civilization, and about the brutal mathematics of survival that shaped their worldview permanently. Some became more compassionate, understanding the arbitrary nature of survival and death. Others became harder and more ruthless, convinced that mercy was a luxury that could prove fatal. These childhood experiences during extreme winters created adults who approached life with a fundamental understanding of scarcity and vulnerability that modern people rarely develop. They understood that comfort and security were temporary conditions that could disappear overnight. They valued practical skills and tangible resources in ways that people who have never faced true scarcity cannot fully appreciate. The intergenerational trauma from these extreme winter events influenced medieval culture in ways that are still visible in historical records. Folk tales and legends often contain warnings about winter that seem exaggerated until viewed in the context of these catastrophic climate events. Religious practices and seasonal celebrations developed around the psychological need to find hope and meaning in the face of annual survival challenges. Art and literature from medieval periods often reflect the psychological impact of winter survival challenges in subtle ways. The themes of death and renewal, the emphasis on community and mutual support, and the preoccupation with divine providence all make more sense when understood as responses to societies that regularly faced existential challenges during winter months. The economic systems that developed in medieval Europe were also shaped by the need to survive extreme winter events. The emphasis on local self-sufficiency, the development of guilds and mutual aid societies, and the creation of systems for storing and preserving resources all reflected the reality that communities needed to be prepared for disasters that could cut them off from outside help for months at a time. Even architectural styles and construction techniques were influenced by the need to survive extreme winters. The thick walls, small windows, and central hearths that characterized medieval buildings were not just aesthetic choices, but survival necessities. The layout of medieval towns and villages often reflected defensive considerations, not just against human enemies, but against the environmental enemy of winter weather. The legal systems that governed medieval communities also reflected the reality of winter survival challenges. Laws about resource sharing, property rights during emergencies, and obligations for mutual aid were all developed in response to the practical needs of communities that regularly faced life or death challenges during winter months. These legal frameworks often included provisions for emergency powers that could be invoked during extreme weather events. Community leaders might be granted authority to requisition private resources, impose rationing systems, or make decisions about resource allocation that would be unacceptable during normal times. These emergency powers reflected the understanding that normal social rules might need to be suspended when survival was at stake. The religious institutions that dominated medieval life were also fundamentally shaped by the harsh realities of winter survival. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were community survival centers that coordinated emergency responses during the worst climate disasters. When extreme winters struck, church buildings often became refugee shelters, where entire communities would huddle together sharing body heat and whatever resources the church had managed to stockpile. Priests and religious leaders found themselves serving as both spiritual guides and practical survival coordinators. They had to make decisions about distributing church resources that were just as morally complex as those faced by secular leaders. Should the church's stored grain go to the most faithful parishioners, or to those most in need? Should church buildings be open to refugees from other communities, potentially overwhelming local resources? Should religious ceremonies continue when the fuel needed for heating might mean the difference between life and death for congregation members? The theological implications of these survival challenges were profound. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? Why did some families survive while others perished, often despite similar levels of preparation and faith? These questions drove the development of medieval theology in ways that are still visible in religious thought today. The concept of divine testing, the emphasis on acceptance of suffering, and the promise of rewards in the afterlife all took on immediate practical significance for people facing the annual threat of winter death. Monastic communities developed some of the most sophisticated winter survival strategies in medieval Europe. But even these religious experts weren't immune to catastrophic failures. Monasteries were often better positioned to survive extreme winters because they had larger communities that could share resources and labor, more systematic approaches to food storage and preservation, and often better construction techniques for their buildings. But monasteries also faced unique challenges during extreme winter events. Their obligations to provide charity to the surrounding community meant that they couldn't hoard resources purely for their own survival. During the worst winters, monasteries would be overwhelmed with refugees seeking food and shelter, forcing the monks to choose between their charitable obligations and their own community's survival. The records kept by monastic communities provide some of the best documentation of medieval winter disasters, but these records also reveal the psychological toll that survival decisions took on religious communities. Monks who had dedicated their lives to serving others found themselves forced to turn away starving families when their own resources were depleted. The spiritual crisis created by these impossible choices led some monks to question their faith entirely, while others developed even more rigid beliefs about divine will and human suffering. The agricultural knowledge preserved in monastic libraries was crucial for community survival. But this knowledge was often inadequate for dealing with extreme climate events that fell outside the range of normal experience. Monks might have detailed records of successful farming techniques for normal years, but when volcanic winters or Little Ice Age conditions struck, this traditional knowledge became useless or even counterproductive. The networks of communication between monasteries were among the most sophisticated information systems in medieval Europe, but even these networks broke down during extreme winter events. When travel became impossible and communication links were severed by weather, communities lost access to information about survival techniques that might have saved lives. A monastery that had developed an effective way to preserve food during extended cold periods might not be able to share this knowledge with other communities facing the same challenges. The breakdown of these communication networks also meant that communities couldn't coordinate their responses to large-scale disasters. A region that had surplus resources might be unable to help neighboring areas that were facing starvation, not because of unwillingness to help, but because of the practical impossibility of transporting resources during extreme weather conditions. The isolation created by winter weather was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval survival challenges. Modern people who feel lonely or disconnected can reach out through multiple communication channels to maintain social contact. Medieval families facing extreme winters were completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time, not knowing whether their neighbours were alive or dead, whether help might be coming, or whether they were the only people left in their entire region. This isolation was particularly difficult for people who had been used to travelling or trading with distant communities. Merchants who normally ranged across wide territories found themselves trapped in single locations, often in communities where they were viewed as outsiders competing for scarce resources. Craftsmen who depended on materials from distant sources had to adapt their techniques to use only local materials, often with results that were far inferior to their normal work. The psychological stress of this isolation was compounded by the constant awareness that any mistake or accident could be fatal when no outside help was available. A broken leg that might be a minor inconvenience during normal times could become a death sentence during an extreme winter. A house fire that destroyed a family's shelter and stored resources meant almost certain death with no possibility of refuge elsewhere. The knowledge systems that communities depended on for winter survival were extremely fragile during these periods of isolation. If the person who knew how to repair the grain mill died during an early winter disease outbreak, the entire community might face starvation, even if they had adequate grain stores. If the woman who knew the most effective techniques for preserving food became too ill to share her knowledge, crucial survival information could be lost just when it was most needed. These knowledge bottlenecks created cascading failures that were impossible to predict or prevent. A community might survive the initial challenges of an extreme winter only to face disaster later in the season when specialized knowledge or skills became necessary. The death of a single knowledgeable individual could doom an entire community, making survival as much a matter of luck as preparation. The social hierarchies that governed medieval communities often broke down during extreme survival situations, but not always in ways that improved everyone's chances. Sometimes the collapse of normal social order led to more egalitarian resource sharing that helped more people survive. But just as often, it led to the emergence of more ruthless power structures, where the strongest individuals hoarded resources at the expense of the weakest. Women often found their social status changing dramatically during extreme winter events. In normal times, they might be excluded from many decision-making processes, but during survival crises, their knowledge of food preservation, childcare, and household management became crucial for community survival. Some women gained significant influence and authority during these periods, while others found themselves even more vulnerable than usual as communities prioritized the survival of men who could perform heavy labor. Children faced particularly complex challenges during extreme winter events. They needed more protection and resources relative to their ability to contribute to survival efforts, making them vulnerable to abandonment or neglect when resources became critically scarce. But children also represented the future of the community, making their survival crucial for long-term recovery. The decisions communities made about protecting children during extreme winters often determined whether those communities could rebuild after the crisis passed. The elderly occupied an even more precarious position in these survival calculations. Their knowledge and experience were often invaluable for community survival, but their physical frailty made them consumers of resources rather than producers. Communities had to weigh the value of elder knowledge against the cost of keeping elderly people alive when resources were limited. These calculations were brutal, but often unavoidable. The disabled faced the harshest mathematics of survival during extreme winter events. People with physical or mental disabilities, who might be supported by their communities during normal times, often became impossible burdens when everyone was struggling to survive. The moral complexity of these situations was staggering, but the practical realities were often unforgiving. Communities that tried to maintain support for all their members sometimes found that their compassion led to the death of everyone, while communities that made harsh choices about resource allocation sometimes managed to save at least some lives. These survival hierarchies weren't necessarily based on malice or prejudice, though these factors certainly played roles. More often, they were based on cold calculations about who could contribute most to community survival and who was most likely to survive, regardless of the level of support provided. But the psychological impact of making these calculations was devastating for everyone involved, creating trauma that lasted long after the immediate survival crisis had passed. The tools and technologies available for winter survival were primitive by modern standards, but they represented the cutting edge of human ingenuity for their time. Every piece of equipment, every technique, every innovation had been developed through generations of trial and error, often at the cost of countless lives. The families and communities that survived were the ones who had learned to make the most effective use of these limited tools. Fire-making technology was perhaps the most crucial survival skill, but it was also one of the most unreliable. Flint and steel could produce sparks, but starting a fire from sparks required tinder that was completely dry, kindling that caught easily, and fuel that would sustain combustion. During wet or extremely cold conditions, even experienced firemakers might struggle for hours to create flames. The loss of fire-making materials or the inability to produce fire could doom a family within days. Food preservation techniques were equally crucial and equally unreliable. Smoking meat required consistent fires and suitable weather conditions that weren't always available. Salt preservation required salt that was expensive and not always obtainable. Drying techniques depended on specific temperature and humidity conditions that might not occur when needed. Fermentation processes could go wrong in ways that made food poisonous rather than preserved. Every preservation method was a gamble with stakes measured in human lives. Water procurement and storage presented constant challenges that required both technical knowledge and physical labor. Wells could freeze solid, making it impossible to access groundwater. Surface water sources might be contaminated or completely frozen. Melting snow or ice required fuel that was needed for heating and cooking. Storing water in containers that wouldn't crack when frozen required materials and techniques that weren't always available. Clothing and textile production were essential for winter survival, but they required resources and skills that took years to develop. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, tanning hides, and sewing garments were time-consuming processes that had to be completed during warmer months in preparation for winter needs. A family that lost their textile production capabilities during a disaster might not be able to replace essential clothing before the next winter arrived. Building and construction techniques for winter-resistant structures required knowledge that was often passed down through apprenticeship systems that could be disrupted by demographic disasters. The skills needed to build walls that would keep out wind, roofs that wouldn't collapse under snow loads, and heating systems that would function efficiently were specialized knowledge that couldn't be quickly learned during emergency situations. Tool-making and repair capabilities were crucial for maintaining the equipment needed for winter survival, but they required raw materials and skills that weren't always available. A broken plow might seem like a spring problem, but if it couldn't be repaired during winter months, it could prevent a family from planting crops the following year, creating a survival crisis that extended beyond the immediate winter season. The transportation technologies available during medieval times were completely inadequate for dealing with extreme winter conditions. Horses and oxen needed feed that was often unavailable during harsh winters. Wheeled vehicles couldn't function in deep snow or on icy surfaces. Even walking became extremely difficult or impossible during blizzards or ice storms. These transportation limitations meant that communities were essentially isolated for months at a time, unable to seek help or share resources with neighboring areas. Communication technologies were equally primitive, consisting mainly of human messengers who couldn't travel during extreme weather conditions. Signal fires or bells might work over short distances during good weather, but they were useless during storms or when fuel was needed for survival rather than communication. The inability to coordinate responses to winter disasters meant that communities often faced their challenges in complete isolation, unaware of whether help might be available nearby. Medical technologies were not only primitive, but often actively harmful during winter health crises. Bloodletting weakened people who were already struggling with cold and malnutrition. Herbal remedies that might be helpful in mild cases could be useless or dangerous for people suffering from severe hypothermia or starvation. The lack of understanding about nutrition, infection, and basic physiology meant that medical interventions often made survival situations worse rather than better. The measurement and calculation systems available to medieval people made it difficult for them to plan accurately for winter survival needs. Without precise ways to measure time, temperature, or quantities of food and fuel, families had to rely on rough estimates and traditional rules of thumb that might not be adequate for extreme conditions. The inability to make accurate calculations about resource needs contributed to both waste during abundant times and shortages during critical periods. Storage technologies were crude and unreliable, making it difficult to preserve resources for extended periods. Containers made from wood, clay, or organic materials were vulnerable to moisture, pests, and physical damage. Underground storage pits could flood or collapse. Above-ground storage areas were vulnerable to theft, fire, and weather damage. The loss of stored resources during winter months was often a death sentence for families who had no backup supplies. Lighting technologies were primitive and expensive, contributing to the psychological stress of winter survival. Candles were costly and burned quickly. Oil lamps required fuel that was needed for other purposes. Most families spent the majority of winter nights in complete darkness, unable to work, socialize, or even move around safely in their own homes. This enforced idleness during the longest nights of the year contributed to depression and despair that made survival even more difficult. The cumulative effect of these technological limitations was to make winter survival a constant struggle against the basic physical realities of cold, darkness, and scarcity. Every day required multiple small victories against these challenges, and the failure of any single technology or technique could trigger a cascade of problems that proved fatal. Medieval people weren't less intelligent or capable than modern people, but they were working with tools and knowledge systems that were barely adequate for the challenges they faced. The learning curve for these survival technologies was steep and unforgiving. Mistakes during the learning process could be fatal, but the knowledge needed for survival was too complex to be learned quickly during emergency situations. This created a cruel paradox where people needed years of experience to survive extreme winters, but extreme winters killed people before they could gain that experience. The innovation process for improving these technologies was slow and dangerous. Experiments with new techniques or tools carried the risk of failure during critical survival periods. Communities that tried to innovate during winter months often found that their experiments failed just when they needed reliable techniques most. This risk-averse environment meant that technological improvements happened very slowly, over many generations of gradual refinement. The knowledge preservation systems for these technologies were fragile and vulnerable to disruption. Most survival knowledge was passed down through oral traditions and hands-on training that could be lost when experienced practitioners died during disasters. Unlike written knowledge that could survive the death of individuals, practical survival skills died with their practitioners, creating knowledge bottlenecks that made communities more vulnerable to future disasters. The specialization required for mastering these various technologies meant that communities needed multiple experts to cover all the skills necessary for winter survival. A community might have an expert firemaker, an expert food preserver, an expert builder, and an expert toolmaker, but the loss of any single specialist could create critical gaps in survival capabilities. The interdependence created by this specialization made communities more efficient during normal times, but more vulnerable during disasters that disrupted the social networks that connected specialists with the people who needed their skills. But perhaps the most significant limitation of medieval survival technologies was their dependence on natural resources that could become unavailable during extreme weather events. The best firemaking skills were useless without dry tinder. The most sophisticated food preservation techniques couldn't work without salt or suitable weather conditions. The most advanced building techniques couldn't function without appropriate materials. When extreme winters disrupted the natural systems that provided these essential resources, even the most advanced medieval technologies became inadequate for survival needs. These technological limitations created a ceiling on survival capabilities that couldn't be overcome through individual effort or community cooperation. No matter how well prepared, how knowledgeable, or how determined a community might be, they were still vulnerable to natural disasters that exceeded the capacity of their tools and techniques to provide protection. This fundamental vulnerability was the underlying reality that made medieval winter survival such a precarious enterprise, where even the most successful communities lived just one disaster away from catastrophe. The dependency on natural resources created a house of cards that could collapse with frightening speed. Communities that had thrived for generations could find themselves helpless when the environmental conditions they relied upon shifted beyond their control. And shift they did, with a regularity that should have been predictable, yet somehow always caught people off guard. The forests that provided essential fuel began to show signs of stress long before communities recognized the danger. Trees that had supplied reliable firewood for decades would suddenly start producing wood that burned poorly or not at all. Disease would sweep through woodlands, killing entire groves that families had counted on for winter heating. Over-harvesting during desperate times would strip areas bare, forcing people to travel ever greater distances to find fuel. Distances that became impossible to cover when winter weather set in. But the forests provided more than just firewood. They were the source of nuts, berries, medicinal plants, and game animals that supplemented stored food supplies during the leanest months. When forest ecosystems collapsed under the pressure of climate stress and human exploitation, communities lost not just their backup food sources, but their emergency medical supplies and the materials needed for tool making and construction. The psychological impact of watching familiar landscapes transform into barren wastelands was profound. People who had grown up knowing exactly which trees to cut, which plants to gather, and which areas would provide reliable resources, found themselves strangers in their own territory. The natural knowledge that had been passed down through generations became obsolete within a single season, leaving communities without the environmental literacy they needed to adapt to changing conditions. Rivers and streams that had flowed reliably for centuries would change their courses during extreme weather events, leaving communities that had built their entire survival strategies around specific water sources suddenly high and dry. Mills that had ground grain for generations would become useless when their water sources dried up or froze solid. Wells that had never failed would suddenly go dry or become contaminated when underground water tables shifted. The timing of these resource failures was often cruelly perfect. Just when communities needed their environmental resources most desperately, those resources would become unavailable. A drought during the growing season would be followed by an early freeze that killed what crops had managed to survive. A wet autumn that prevented proper harvest would be followed by a winter so cold that stored foods froze and became inedible. Animal populations that people depended on for meat, milk, and labor were equally vulnerable to environmental disruption. Domestic livestock that had been bred for specific local conditions would suddenly find themselves unable to survive when those conditions changed. Wild game animals would migrate to more favorable regions, leaving human communities without the supplemental protein that had helped them survive previous winters. The interconnected nature of these ecological failures meant that communities couldn't simply adapt by switching to alternative resources. When forests died, the streams that flowed through them would also change. When water sources shifted, the soil quality in surrounding areas would be affected. When animal populations crashed, the natural fertilizers they provided would disappear, making it harder to grow crops the following season. Communities that had developed sophisticated systems for managing their natural resources found that their management techniques became counterproductive when environmental conditions changed. Controlled burning practices that had maintained healthy forests for generations might suddenly trigger uncontrollable wildfires during drought conditions. Irrigation systems that had worked perfectly for decades might cause devastating floods when weather patterns shifted. The speed of these environmental changes often outpaced human ability to develop new survival strategies. Unlike the gradual environmental changes that had occurred over previous centuries, the disruptions associated with major climate events could transform entire regions within a single growing season. Communities that had taken generations to develop sustainable relationships with their local environments found themselves facing completely unfamiliar ecological conditions with no time to experiment or adapt gradually. Knowledge systems that had been based on centuries of accumulated experience became not just useless, but actively misleading when environmental conditions shifted dramatically. Farmers who followed traditional planting schedules might plant too early or too late for the new climate conditions. Hunters who tracked animals according to traditional seasonal patterns might find that those patterns no longer applied. Gatherers who knew exactly when and where to find specific plants might discover that those plants no longer grew in familiar locations. The social implications of these environmental failures were staggering. Communities that had maintained stable populations for generations would suddenly find themselves facing mass migration as people fled regions that could no longer support human life. The refugee streams created by environmental collapse would overwhelm the resources of destination communities, creating conflicts that made survival even more difficult for everyone involved. Trade relationships that had developed over centuries would collapse when the goods that formed the basis of those relationships became unavailable. A community that had specialized in producing specific items for trade might find themselves with nothing to offer in exchange for the food and fuel they needed to survive. The economic networks that had allowed communities to specialize and trade for necessities would break down, forcing everyone to become self-sufficient just when self-sufficiency had become impossible. The cultural knowledge associated with specific environments would be lost when those environments changed beyond recognition. Traditional stories, songs, and ceremonies that encoded important survival information would become irrelevant when the conditions they described no longer existed. The spiritual connections that tied communities to their landscapes would be severed, creating psychological trauma that affected people's will to survive. Children who grew up during these periods of environmental disruption would never develop the deep knowledge of local conditions that had been essential for survival in previous generations. They would become adults without the environmental literacy that their parents and grandparents had taken for granted, making them less capable of adapting to future changes or crises. The technological adaptations that communities developed in response to environmental changes were often temporary solutions that created new vulnerabilities. A community that switched from wood burning to peat burning might survive one winter, only to discover that their peat sources were exhausted by spring. Innovations developed during crisis situations were often unsustainable over longer periods, creating cycles of temporary success, followed by even more severe failures. Recovery from major environmental disruptions could take decades or centuries, assuming recovery was possible at all. Forests that had been destroyed during crisis periods might never regrow in the same form. Water sources that had been depleted or contaminated might remain unusable for generations. Soil that had been damaged by desperate farming practices might lose its fertility permanently. The cascading effects of environmental failure created feedback loops that made recovery increasingly difficult. A community that had been forced to overexploit their remaining resources during one crisis would be less able to cope with the next crisis. Environmental damage caused by survival activities during extreme winters would make those communities more vulnerable to future extreme winters. Some regions experienced what amounted to permanent environmental collapse, becoming uninhabitable for human communities that had lived there for centuries. These areas would be abandoned entirely, their former inhabitants joining the streams of climate refugees seeking new homes in regions that were already struggling to support their existing populations. The documentary evidence for these environmental disasters is often fragmentary because the people who experienced them were focused on survival rather than record keeping. Many of the most catastrophic environmental collapses are known only through indirect evidence like pollen samples, tree rings, and archaeological remains that show sudden abandonment of previously thriving communities. Modern climate research has revealed that many of these medieval environmental disasters were part of larger global climate patterns that medieval people had no way to understand or predict. Changes in solar radiation, volcanic activity, and ocean circulation patterns all contributed to environmental disruptions that seemed random and incomprehensible to the people experiencing them. The inability to predict or understand these environmental changes made it impossible for communities to prepare adequately for them. Even communities with sophisticated environmental knowledge and resource management systems found themselves overwhelmed by changes that fell completely outside their range of experience. But environmental failure was just one piece of a larger puzzle of medieval winter mortality. Social breakdown often proved just as deadly as resource scarcity, creating human-made disasters that compounded the natural challenges of winter survival. The social fabric that held communities together during prosperous times would often unravel under the stress of prolonged survival challenges. Neighbors who had been friends and allies during better times would become competitors and enemies when resources became scarce. The cooperative relationships that were essential for community survival would break down just when they were needed most. Trust, which was the foundation of all community cooperation, would evaporate when people became desperate enough to steal from each other. A family that discovered their firewood had been taken during the night would become suspicious of all their neighbors. Communities that had shared resources freely during abundant times would become hoarding, suspicious groups of individuals looking out only for their own families. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies during survival crises created power vacuums that were often filled by the most ruthless individuals rather than the most capable or wise. People who had never held leadership positions might seize control during chaotic periods, making decisions that served their own interests rather than the community's survival needs. Violence would escalate as desperation increased and normal social controls broke down. Disputes that might have been resolved peacefully during normal times could explode into deadly conflicts when people were weakened by cold and hunger. The weapons that were used for hunting and self-defense could easily be turned against neighbors during resource conflicts. The legal systems that governed community life were often inadequate for dealing with the extreme situations that arose during winter survival crises. Laws that had been designed for normal times didn't address questions like whether it was acceptable to steal firewood from a neighbor who appeared to have more than they needed, or whether communities had the right to expel members who were consuming resources without contributing to survival efforts. Religious and moral frameworks that provided guidance during normal times often broke down when faced with the harsh realities of survival mathematics. People who had lived according to strict moral codes found themselves forced to make choices that violated their deepest beliefs. The psychological stress of these moral compromises could be as devastating as the physical stress of cold and hunger. Family structures that had provided stability and support during better times could become sources of conflict during extreme survival situations. Parents might favor certain children over others when resources were scarce. Adult children might abandon elderly parents who could no longer contribute to family survival efforts. Spouses might blame each other for inadequate preparation or poor survival decisions. The gender roles that had organized community life during normal times often became problematic during survival crises. Women who had been excluded from certain types of decision-making might possess crucial knowledge about food preservation or household management, but their voices might still be ignored during critical planning sessions. Men who had specialized in activities that were less relevant during winter months might struggle to find ways to contribute to survival efforts. Children became both precious resources and dangerous burdens during extreme winter situations. They represented the future of the community and needed protection, but they also consumed resources without being able to contribute significantly to survival efforts. The decisions communities made about how much of their limited resources to allocate to childcare often determined whether those communities would exist after the crisis passed. The elderly faced particularly complex social challenges during survival crises. Their knowledge and experience were often invaluable for community survival, but their physical frailty made them consumers of resources rather than producers. Communities had to balance the value of elder knowledge against the cost of keeping elderly people alive, when every calorie and every unit of fuel was precious. Mental health problems, while not understood in modern terms, were clearly visible in medieval communities during extreme winter periods. People would develop what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorders. These psychological problems would reduce their ability to make good survival decisions and contribute to community efforts. The social isolation created by winter weather conditions would exacerbate these mental health problems. People who were used to regular social contact would find themselves trapped with the same small group of family members for months at a time. The lack of privacy, the constant stress, and the absence of normal social outlets would create psychological pressure that could explode into violence or collapse into despair. Communication breakdowns between communities would leave people uncertain about whether their neighbors were surviving, whether help might be available, or whether they were the last people left alive in their region. This uncertainty would create additional psychological stress that made all other survival challenges more difficult to manage. The breakdown of normal social rituals and celebrations would deprive people of the psychological support that these activities normally provided. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings that had marked the passage of time and provided hope during dark periods would be cancelled when resources were too scarce to support them. Educational systems that had passed down crucial knowledge from one generation to the next would be disrupted when survival became the only priority. Children, who should have been learning essential skills, would instead be focused entirely on immediate survival needs. The knowledge gaps created during these periods would make communities less capable of dealing with future crises. The social networks that connected communities with each other would break down when travel became impossible and communication systems failed. Communities that had relied on mutual aid agreements with neighboring areas would find themselves isolated and unable to call for help when they needed it most. Marriage and family formation patterns would be disrupted during extreme winter periods, affecting community demographics for years after the immediate crisis had passed. Young adults, who should have been forming new households, would delay marriage when survival was uncertain. Birth rates would drop as communities focused their limited resources on keeping existing members alive rather than supporting new children. The social institutions that had provided stability and continuity during normal times would often prove inadequate for dealing with survival crises. Churches, guilds, and community organizations that had functioned well during prosperous periods would find themselves overwhelmed by the scale of need during extreme winters. Recovery from social breakdown often took longer than recovery from resource shortages because trust, once lost, was difficult to rebuild. Communities that had survived extreme winters through cooperation and mutual aid might rebuild quickly, while communities that had fractured during the crisis might never fully recover their social cohesion. The memory of social breakdown during survival crises would influence community behavior for generations after the immediate danger had passed. People who had experienced the collapse of social institutions during extreme winters would often become more self-reliant and less trusting of community cooperation in future situations. The lessons learned from social breakdown during medieval winter crises were often contradictory and difficult to apply to future situations. Communities might learn that cooperation was essential for survival, but also that cooperation could become impossible when resources were too scarce. These contradictory lessons would create confusion and conflict when communities tried to prepare for future crises. Yet despite all these challenges, some communities did manage to maintain their social cohesion, even during the most extreme winter survival situations. These success stories provide insights into the social factors that could make the difference between community survival and community collapse during medieval winter crises. The communities that maintained their social fabric during extreme winters were typically those that had developed strong traditions of mutual aid and resource sharing before the crisis struck. They had established clear protocols for emergency situations and had leaders who were trusted by community members to make fair decisions about resource allocation. These successful communities also typically had strong cultural identities that helped bind members together during difficult times. Shared religious beliefs, ethnic traditions, or historical experiences created bonds that were strong enough to withstand the stress of survival challenges. But even the most socially cohesive communities could be overwhelmed if the survival challenges they faced exceeded their capacity to cope. Social strength was necessary for winter survival, but it wasn't sufficient by itself when the environmental and resource challenges became too extreme. The combination of environmental failure and social breakdown created a perfect storm that made medieval winter survival nearly impossible for many communities. When natural resources became unavailable and human cooperation broke down simultaneously, communities found themselves facing challenges that exceeded any possible response. These combined disasters created mortality rates that were staggering even by medieval standards. Entire regions could lose 50% or more of their population during a single extreme winter. Villages that had existed for centuries would be completely abandoned. The survivors would carry the trauma of these experiences for the rest of their lives, passing down both practical survival knowledge and psychological scars to future generations. The recovery process from these combined disasters was slow and often incomplete. Communities that had lost both their natural resource base and their social cohesion would struggle to rebuild either aspect of their survival capacity. Many regions that experienced severe combined disasters never fully recovered their previous population levels or economic vitality. The historical record of these medieval winter disasters is fragmentary because so many of the potential record keepers didn't survive to document their experiences. The communities that were hit hardest by winter mortality were often those least likely to leave behind written accounts of their struggles. Modern research has revealed that many of the most devastating medieval winter disasters occurred when multiple crisis factors converged simultaneously. Climate events, disease outbreaks, military conflicts, and economic disruptions would combine to create survival challenges that exceeded any single community's ability to cope. Understanding these historical patterns provides sobering perspective on the fragility of human communities when faced with extreme environmental challenges. Medieval people weren't less intelligent or capable than modern people, but they were working with resource bases and social systems that could be overwhelmed by natural forces beyond their control. The lessons from medieval winter survival aren't just historical curiosities. They provide insights into the fundamental challenges that all human communities face when environmental conditions exceed their adaptive capacity. The strategies that worked for medieval survivors, cooperation, resource conservation, long-term planning, and community resilience, remain relevant for modern communities facing environmental challenges. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval winter survival is the recognition that individual preparation and effort, while necessary, weren't sufficient for survival during extreme conditions. The families and communities that survived were those that understood that winter wasn't just a personal challenge, but a collective test that required coordinated responses and mutual support. The mathematics of medieval winter survival were brutal but clear. Communities needed adequate resources, functional social systems, and environmental conditions that remained within manageable parameters. When any one of these factors failed completely, survival became nearly impossible. When multiple factors failed simultaneously, survival became a matter of luck rather than skill or preparation. The survivors weren't necessarily the strongest, the smartest, or the most virtuous. They were often simply the ones who happened to be in the right place at the right time, with the right combination of resources, knowledge, and social support. This randomness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval winter survival. The understanding that all the preparation and effort in the world couldn't guarantee survival when nature decided to test human limits. Yet people continued to try, year after year, generation after generation, because the alternative was to simply give up and accept extinction. The human drive to survive, to adapt, and to hope for better conditions was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval winter survival. People who faced impossible odds continued to fight for life, to care for their families, and to maintain their communities even when logic suggested that their efforts were futile. This persistence in the face of overwhelming challenges was the foundation of human civilization's ability to survive the medieval period and continue developing toward the more secure and prosperous societies that would eventually emerge. Every family that survived an extreme winter, every community that maintained its cohesion during a crisis, every individual who passed down survival knowledge to the next generation was contributing to humanity's gradual development of better tools and strategies for dealing with environmental challenges. The medieval winter survivors weren't heroes in the modern sense. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because the alternative was death. Their stories remind us that human survival has always depended not just on individual strength or intelligence, but on the collective ability of communities to support each other through impossible challenges and to maintain hope even when hope seemed irrational. But their stories also remind us that survival is never guaranteed, that the natural world is capable of creating challenges that exceed human adaptive capacity, and that the comfortable, secure lives that many people enjoy today are built on foundations that remain fundamentally vulnerable to forces beyond our control. The echo of those medieval winters still resonates through human consciousness, encoded in cultural memories of scarcity and vulnerability that influence how we think about security, community, and our relationship with the natural world. Their legacy lives not in monuments or written records, but in the simple fact that we're here today. Every person alive carries the genetic inheritance of ancestors who somehow, against impossible odds, made it through winters that claimed millions. The survivors didn't just endure, they adapted, learned, and passed down hard-won wisdom that gradually shifted the odds in humanity's favour. But perhaps the most profound aspect of medieval winter survival was how it shaped human psychology in ways that persist to this day. The seasonal anxiety that many people feel as autumn approaches, the instinctive urge to stock up on supplies before winter, the deep satisfaction of a warm home when cold winds blow outside, these aren't just personal quirks. They're evolutionary echoes of ancestors who lived with the constant awareness that winter meant death was always just a few degrees away. The cultural traditions that developed around winter survival tell their own story of human adaptation. Harvest festivals weren't just celebrations of abundance. They were desperate attempts to ensure communities worked together to gather and preserve enough food for the dark months ahead. Christmas and other midwinter celebrations weren't originally about gift-giving and family gatherings. They were psychological survival tools, ways to maintain hope and community bonds during the darkest, coldest, most dangerous time of year. Even our modern architecture carries DNA from those medieval survival strategies. The steep roofs designed to shed snow, the thick walls that provide insulation, the central placement of heating systems. These features that we take for granted as aesthetic choices were originally developed as life or death necessities by people who understood that their buildings were the primary barrier between their families and extinction. The food preservation techniques that medieval survivors developed through trial and error became the foundation of culinary traditions that persist today. Smoking, salting, fermenting, drying. These weren't cooking methods. They were survival technologies. Every culture's traditional winter foods tell a story of ancestors who figured out how to make nutrition last through months when nothing fresh could be obtained. The social structures that governed medieval communities were also shaped by winter survival needs in ways that influenced human civilization for centuries afterward. The concepts of mutual aid, community responsibility, and shared resources that became central to many political and religious systems were originally developed as practical responses to the reality that no individual family could survive winter alone. The medical knowledge that medieval people accumulated about treating cold-related injuries and illnesses became the foundation for later advances in understanding human physiology. While their treatments were often ineffective or harmful, their observations about the effects of cold, malnutrition, and stress on the human body provided crucial information that later generations would build upon. The psychological strategies that medieval survivors developed for coping with months of darkness, isolation, and constant fear became embedded in cultural practices that helped later generations maintain mental health during difficult periods. Storytelling traditions, religious practices, and social rituals all evolved partly as tools for maintaining psychological resilience during the annual ordeal of winter survival. The economic systems that developed in medieval Europe were fundamentally shaped by the need to accumulate and distribute resources for winter survival. The emphasis on local production, the development of storage and distribution networks, and the creation of financial instruments for managing seasonal variations in resource availability all reflected the reality that communities needed sophisticated systems for surviving the months when production was impossible. Even the legal systems that governed medieval communities reflected winter survival realities. Laws about resource sharing during emergencies, regulations about fuel gathering and storage, and provisions for community support during disasters all developed in response to the practical challenges of keeping people alive through winter months. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval winter survival challenges laid groundwork for later developments that would eventually make winter survival more reliable. Improvements in building techniques, heating systems, food preservation methods, and clothing design all emerged from the desperate need to solve problems that killed people every year. The agricultural practices that medieval farmers developed were also shaped by winter survival needs. Crop selection, harvesting techniques, soil management, and livestock breeding all evolved in response to the requirement that farming communities produce enough surplus during growing seasons to sustain themselves through months of agricultural dormancy. The trade networks that connected medieval communities were largely driven by winter survival needs. Communities that specialized in producing specific goods needed to trade for the diverse resources required for winter survival: salt for food preservation, metals for tools, textiles for clothing, fuel for heating. All of these necessities drove the development of commercial relationships that extended far beyond local areas. The military organizations that dominated medieval politics were also influenced by winter survival challenges. Armies had to be fed, housed, and equipped during winter months, creating logistical challenges that influenced everything from campaign timing to fortress design. The social hierarchies that supported military systems were partly based on the need to organize resources for survival during the months when productive activity was impossible. The religious institutions that provided stability and continuity during medieval times were fundamentally shaped by their role in winter survival. Churches accumulated and distributed resources, provided shelter during emergencies, and maintained the social bonds that were essential for community survival. The theological frameworks that these institutions developed often reflected the psychological needs of people facing annual life or death challenges. The educational systems that preserved and transmitted knowledge during medieval times were also influenced by winter survival needs. The skills that were considered essential for children to learn, the knowledge that was preserved in written form, and the institutions that maintained intellectual continuity all reflected the practical requirements of surviving in a world where winter was a recurring existential threat. The artistic traditions that flourished during medieval times often reflected themes related to survival, endurance, and the struggle between human will and natural forces. The literature, music, and visual arts of the period frequently dealt with themes of hardship, community, and the triumph of human spirit over adversity. themes that resonated with audiences who understood these challenges intimately. The scientific knowledge that accumulated during medieval times was partly driven by the need to better understand and predict the natural forces that made winter survival so challenging. Observations about weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and human physiology were motivated by practical survival needs as much as by intellectual curiosity. The philosophical and ethical frameworks that developed during medieval times were also shaped by the moral challenges created by winter survival situations. Questions about individual versus community responsibility, the obligations of the strong toward the weak, and the limits of human duty in extreme circumstances all emerged from the practical dilemmas that arose when resources were scarce and survival was uncertain. The demographic patterns that characterized medieval Europe reflected the ongoing impact of winter mortality on population growth and distribution. The age structures of communities, marriage patterns, birth rates, and migration flows were all influenced by the reality that significant portions of the population died during harsh winters, particularly among the very young, the elderly, and the poor. The economic cycles that governed medieval life were largely determined by the annual rhythm of preparation for winter, survival through winter, and recovery from winter. The accumulation of resources during productive seasons, the careful rationing during dormant seasons, and the rebuilding that followed survival crises created economic patterns that influenced everything from individual family planning to international trade relationships. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the frozen wasteland of medieval winter, where survival was measured not in comfort or convenience, but in heartbeats that lasted until spring. Tonight, we've walked alongside our ancestors through months of darkness, cold, and hunger that would break most modern spirits within days. We've seen how ordinary people became extraordinary survivors, not through heroism, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to let winter win. Their legacy lives in every warm home, every stocked pantry, every winter night that we sleep peacefully, knowing that dawn will come and we'll still be breathing. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in your blood runs the strength of those who faced the impossible and lived to see another spring.